Welcome to episode 218 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Darren Mott, who served in the FBI for 20 years. During his first field assignment to the Charlotte Division, he worked on a squad that handled cybercrime cases, and that quickly became his specialty in the FBI. In this episode, Darren reviews a software intellectual property theft case codenamed Operation Sudden Urge. This online piracy investigation, which used a well-placed informant, multiple clandestine computer servers, and undercover identities, resulted in search warrants and arrests in over 20 U.S. cities and across 7 countries, making it, at the time, one of the FBI's largest online takedowns. Later in his career, Darren was promoted several times, initially to the Cyber Division at FBI headquarters, FBI HQ, then to run a cybercrime squad in the Cleveland Division, and then back to FBI HQ as a unit chief and assistant to the Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterintelligence Division. His last transfer was to the Birmingham Division, where he was the supervisory special agent of the Counterintelligence Squad and outreach coordinator. Since retiring from the FBI, Darren is currently working as a senior staff member and deputy operations director at the National Cybersecurity Operations Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Darren is also the host of the CyBUr Guy Podcast, and that's CyBUr Guy Podcast, which features discussions on historical FBI cyber and counterintelligence cases and current cybercrime issues. So make sure you check out Darren's podcast. I'll have a link in this episode's show notes. If you've ever thought about working for the FBI, make sure you keep listening to the very end of his interview. Darren and I deliver a kind of impromptu recruiting message, especially for teachers and for those interested in working for the FBI in Huntsville, Alabama, where a brand new FBI campus is under construction at the Redstone Arsenal. I wrote something in my December reader team email, which has proven to be very popular. It's about when the FBI investigates murder. I wanted you to know that I resent that reader team email out for those who missed it the first time. Of course, I want to welcome new listeners and invite you to join my reader team. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You can join my reader team on my website or use the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Darren Mott. Hi, Darren. How are you?
Good morning, Jerry. How are you? Good. Thanks.
Well, I am excited to have you on the podcast today because I actually had an email from a listener who was requesting more cyber case reviews. And so I was able to tell her that I got one coming and that she can listen to more cyber episodes on your podcast.
Yes, that would be fantastic. The CyBUr Guy.
Yes. So, and that's spelled CyBUr Guy. And I think that's very clever. You got the BU for bureau and bucar and all of that in there.
Yep. That it kind of came to me as an epiphany one day when I was trying to come up with a name for it and seemed to fit.
Well, what I'll do is I will put a link to your podcast in this episode's show notes. So those who really, really enjoy, cyber case reviews will be able to access many, many more over at the CyBUr Guy.
Well, great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Do you want to give us like a really quick introduction and then we'll get into the details?
Sure. So I joined the FBI in 1999, had been a high school teacher prior to that, and that's a whole long story. You can hear how I got there on my own podcast. I'm not going to bore your folks here with that. So I joined in 99, went to new agent training in 2000. I was assigned as a first office agent to the Charlotte Field Division. And at that time, the FBI was still trying to wrap its head around what to do with all of this cyber activity. At the time, in the early 2000s, it was a lot of denial of service attacks and some criminal stuff. And it was just starting to become a major problem. Charlotte was one of the 16 field offices out of the 56 that actually had a dedicated cyber squad. Now, they didn't name it a cyber squad at the time. It was called a National Infrastructure Protection Center squad. I'm not sure who came up with that, but I'm sure they became an SESer at some point because of it. But so we were working all the cyber matters at that time. And so that's how I kind of got into the cyber world there.
I learned that the name of the case was Sudden Urge, which sounds like anything but an FBI.
Well, there's two ways to create a case name or an undercover operation name or whatever. You can come up with your own and just say, hey, this is what I want to use and get approval. I did not realize that. When I started working on this case, which dealt with online software piracy, my field training agent was the good guy, but he wasn't a great training agent. So no one told me how to do it. So they said, hey, call this unit at headquarters. They'll give you a list of 5 and pick one off of it. Of the 5 choices I had, that was the best option. And so that's what I went with, realizing years later, I could have just made up my own. But, it is what it is.
I'm sorry if I'm being disrespectful, but if Operation Sudden Urge was the best one, I can only imagine.
Yeah, it was a bad batch, I'll be honest.
It sounds like a title of a porn movie.
Yeah, well, hey.
But the case was, much, much more successful than the title would indicate. So how did it all start?
So at the time in the 2000s, software piracy became a big, huge issue because you had these groups that were compromising Digital Copyright Act matters by releasing movies, music, games, software on the internet for free. So, and it's still the same today. If you wanted to buy a movie, there's the FBI seal that pops up that says this is, you can't steal this or what have you. And DVDs have protection, so it makes it hard to copy. But bad guys are always much more ahead of the technology than law enforcement. And so there's always ways around digital protections. And these guys were compromising that digital protection. So in 2000, Windows 95, Windows 98 were big operating systems. You could get that for free on the internet because these groups existed to make all of that material free. And you may think, well, if I download some movies, I download some music, really, what's the big harm? Well, at the time, the amount of loss to legitimate business was $6 billion globally. And that number just rose year after year. And so there had been a case out of the Chicago field office that they came to Charlotte to do a search warrant on the leader of this wares group. And that was the name of these groups, wares groups. It's short for software, put a Z on the end, it becomes wares. They did a search warrant at his college dorm room, gathered some evidence, and then the next day they were getting ready to go back to Chicago with the evidence they had and whatever information they had. Realized they had about 8 hours of time to spend before their plane was to leave, and they knew that they had another potential subject who they could go talk to, who they'd identified as part of their investigation, but they didn't do a search warrant at his residence because he had never shown any evidence of distributing any of this illegal material, which was illegal to disseminate this information on the internet. It was violation of copyright laws. And so they decided, hey, let's just go see if we can find him and talk to him. So they went to his house, talked to him, got some information from him. He had joined the group to he knew his friend who they had done the search warrant the day before was doing this illegal stuff, and it kind of irritated him. So he wanted to see if he could get into these groups to figure out what they were doing. That was a part of his personality, was wanting to learn how these things worked. And so he said, here's how it works. So let me lay it out for you. Here's what it all means. And he laid out the wares scene and how these groups were competitors, how if the group that broke the copyright protection on a certain piece of software released it, that was the same copied version of that the whole world took. You didn't have multiple types of copyrighted instances. So whoever did it first got the credit for it. It was a lot of internal, credit gathering by these groups. And so he said, here's how it all works. They said, hey, that's very interesting. That would help us with a lot of our investigations. Would you be interested to work for the FBI as a source? He said, yeah, sure. So they assigned him to our white collar squad in Charlotte because at the time, again, they didn't recognize what he knew and what they had. And so they assigned it to that particular squad. The agent who was his handler came to me and said, look, I got this source. He's showing me this copyright stuff. It's all cyber related. It's all online. It's not like the VHS tapes you could get on Canal Street in New York. It's nothing like that. It's a much larger issue, but we really don't have time to do what he wants to do. So I said, sure. I went and listened to what he was doing, took him over as a source, and we came up with a methodology or a plan to create an undercover operation to try to look at these groups and try to target more of them at one time. A lot of the cases at the time were focused on a single wares group. Ours focused on as many groups as we could find to find as many people as we could take down ultimately.
All right. Well, you're giving me the short version, but when the agent from the white collar crime squad came over to you, did you immediately recognize what you had, that you had this valuable source, or were you just thinking, I'll talk to him and see what happens?
Yeah, not originally, because at the time, obviously for any FBI agent, having a source is a great thing to have because it helps you with your cases. And at the time I had a couple other sources, but they were volunteer cyber guys who were like IT professionals, and they weren't really giving me much information. And so when I started talking about what he started, he basically told me what he told the Chicago agents. Here's what I know. Here's what I have. And so I contacted a couple people at headquarters, and I contacted the local U.S. Attorney's office to say, we have this potential to do this operation. Is that something you would prosecute if we went down that road? And everybody said, yeah, go ahead. Because again, at the time, the laws hadn't caught up to what cyber was. The prosecutors weren't well versed in it. So you could get away with a lot investigatively at that time because no one knew to tell you no. And so we came up with this plan. Here's what we want to do. It was pretty expansive, and everybody said go with it. And I'm like, this is great. Let's work it.
Before we go into the operation and how you laid out everything, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned this, that this was like an advanced level of the VHS and CD disc that used to be for sale of movies and things like that, out on the street.
Right.
We know how the people who made those bootleg copies, they made money off of it. How are people who are doing this online piracy, how are they making money?
Yeah, they were not making money. There was no financial gain to them other than they could get, I guess the financial gain was they didn't have to buy the software, the movies, the music, the game, because there was at the time Xbox and PlayStation were the big consoles, and at least during the time of this investigation, and they were compromising those particular games as well, where you could just download that Xbox game, and if you did a couple modifications on your Xbox, you could play it. But the groups that did it, they did it for reputation, to say, hey, we are the group that, and it still happens today. This is not a problem that has stopped. It continues today. It's just not a priority for investigative entities like the FBI or the Department of Justice. So they still do it periodically, depending on the size of the case and the group and stuff. But it's not like it was back then. But these guys didn't do it for money. They did it for reputation and to say we're the group that does it. Part of them, they think of themselves as Robin Hoods in the sense that why should people have to pay money for this software when they can get it for free because of the way that we have cracked the copyright protection. And then it's funny because each of these groups, when they would crack a piece of software, there would be a text file that comes with the download. So if you downloaded a piece of software, there'd be a text file that would tell you, how to install it, any changes you'd have to make to your system to make it work. Plus, there would be a little thing at the bottom, a stinger that would say, now keep in mind, we are not doing this for illegal activity. If you like this product, make sure you buy it. Buy a version of it. This is for evaluation purposes only. That was what they thought in their head they could use to get away with doing it.
I guess that didn't work.
No, it did not.
So the major loss, and I don't know if you've already mentioned this, but the major loss are to these businesses, these software businesses who are losing
$6 billion a year. And at the time, so imagine you're a small software company that makes one specific piece of software. Let's say you're Adobe at the time. So let's say Adobe is just starting to kick up, and you have Adobe Photoshop, and you sell it for $695 version. Most college kids and folks that are just getting started in their career can't afford $695 Photoshopping type software that early in their career, but they could download it for free. Well, if you have 10 downloads for every single person that buys it individually, you're going to go out of business pretty quick. So the Business Software Alliance was big at noting that for them, for the business software piece alone, it was a $6 billion a year loss. And that equates to thousands of jobs being lost as well. So there's a downstream effect to this downloading of this illicit material. Same thing with movies, music, and games. Like now with the pandemic and the inability to really go to movie theaters, movies that cost $100 million are being released on these streaming services. And I guarantee you, 2 hours after it's released on the streaming service, you can download it for free if you know where to get it.
Wow. So the end user can look at this crime and not necessarily, I can't see them being extremely upset.
Right, correct.
So it's one of those crimes where the average citizen is like, too bad.
Right, correct. Yep, absolutely.
But I can only imagine, again, somebody who manufactures this software, that it is a major, major headache.
Yep, that's absolutely. And then part of that is why some of it is expensive, because they have to build in that loss into their pricing structure.
All right. Well, I am very curious. Two things. First of all, how you were able to identify these people and to, as we say, dismantle and disrupt what they were doing. But I'm also curious as to how you knew what to do. Do you have a cyber background? We're going to get into when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI at the end of the episode. But for now, did you have a cyber background?
Well, if I could go back to when I was 11 years old and playing on a huge mainframe computer that my mother programmed in the bank she worked in 1977, and then she had programmed a little game on this very small monitor for me to play. I was fascinated by that, and that started my love of technology and computers. Yet, ironically, I did not go to college for computer science. I went for biology. I'm not sure why. Again, I would go back and tell myself, hey, stupid, computer science is the way you want to go. But I was around computer science majors. My roommates were all computer science majors, and so I kind of was around that world and largely self-taught. When I was a high school teacher, I was considered the technology guy in the school because I bought my first PC in 1992. It was a Packard Bell computer. It cost, I don't know, $2,000 or so. I had a very slow modem, a very small hard drive, but I was fascinated by it. So I kind of was more of a self-taught cyber guy. And then this particular case really accelerated that because I had to do a lot of networking and hardware building and a lot of network plus stuff on my own without the training, which really honestly is the best way to do it. I went through a lot of cyber training with the FBI, but doing it yourself is the best way to learn. So again, that's a long answer to your question. I was not classically trained in cyber, but you don't necessarily need to be to do what we did.
All right. So you have your basic knowledge of computer science. You have this, fantastic cooperating witness or informant. I don't know which one he was classified as.
He was 270, so he was a confidential informant.
Okay. Who has access and an ability to bring you into this online piracy world. How did you decide how to start this? And did you immediately know that you were going to do this as a Group 2 undercover investigation?
Yeah, so identifying as a Group 2 was pretty easy because so the difference between a Group 2 and a Group 1, I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast before, but you have to have there's certain circumstances that make it a Group 1 that require much more oversight from FBI headquarters. There was a slight question with third-party liability with our particular undercover because what we decided to do was to create a service for these groups where they could store their material. Their biggest problem was storage. And so at the time, the largest hard drives in 2001 or so was about 100 megabytes, which is not, 100 gigabytes, which is not really that big. But that was the largest you could buy, and it was expensive. So it was very hard for them to store their material. And as you continue to crack software, movies, and music and games, it takes up space. And so they didn't have servers at home. They had to find places online to put these things. And plus they had the tools they used to crack the encryption and all this other stuff. And so we decided that we would be provide storage, but not distribute. So that got us around the third-party liability issue, which would have made it a Group 1. And so because we didn't really have that, and it took us a while to convince lawyers that there was no third-party liability, we would not be distributing, that you could not come and as a normal Joe could not come to our site and download anything. The groups could if they wanted to download it somewhere else, but we were not a distribution facility. So that was the big key. There was a difference between distribution and storage. Because of that, we were able to stay as a group too, which made it a little easier to manage because for the first year, you just need field office approval to do that. And then you need headquarters to give you money for it, and which wasn't a problem at the time. So that's how we decided to go with the group 2. And it allowed us to do a lot more things going forward. It ended up being, I think we renewed it 8 times. The group 2 lasted from 2001 to the middle of 2005 when we did our final takedown.
All right. So you are going to create a server. I'm not a computer person, so
Sure,
you had to explain this, but you're creating a server for them just to store their stolen software.
Correct. So it ended up being what we called a server farm. There was multiple servers that had a lot of storage space. We started off with a 1 terabyte size server, which in the wares scene at the time was fantastic. They'd say, well, that's great. You had a lot of server space. And we ultimately targeted one group. So there was one particular wares group that we looked at. And then when other groups found out what we were doing, they would come to us and say, hey, can you do the same for us? And so we were able to bring in ultimately about 6 different wares groups that we had access to because of our capability to store their material. So what we did was personally, we didn't go out and go to Dell or IBM and buy servers. We built them from the ground up. So I went to a small computer company in Charlotte that sold computer parts, and I gave them a lot of money. They loved me. I would go in as an undercover name with an undercover credit card and stuff, and then buy hard drives and processors and motherboards and computer cases and all that stuff. And then we would build them from the ground up. And it ultimately ended up being this 12 terabyte server farm that had 5 or 6 different large servers with a lot of storage space networked together. But the key was we couldn't allow them to go directly into those servers because they would kind of see how it was organized. So they all connected to what we called mirror servers. So we created 3 additional computers that they would log into first that were then connected to the servers. I mean, I'm not going to get into the big technical part of that, but we did a lot of hiding, I guess. I can never pronounce the obfuscating word very well. So we did a lot of hiding of how our network was designed. We worked with the internet service provider to make it appear. Well, actually, we didn't make it appear we were in Canada. We told them that we were in Canada because the problem was they didn't want to store material in the United States because Operation Buccaneer was a customs case a year before that had targeted another wares group and arrested 5 or 6 folks and then they put them on trial and all that stuff. So they recognized that the U.S. was starting to crack down on this, so they didn't want to store anything in the U.S. So my source brought me in as his brother who ran this network farm or the server farm where they could store their material. We said we were in Canada. We had the ISP that we used. AT&T was our original ISP, and we moved to Time Warner Cable ultimately. But we had them change our DNS record so that if you did a whois lookup of our IP address or did a trace route, the last 3 hops were blank. It wouldn't tell you where they went to. So we just always said that, sure, if you do a trace route of our IP address, it looks like it stops in Atlanta, but those 3 dots behind you is the VPN that sends us to the Canadian part. And so the nice thing is at the time in early 2000s, it was very easy to lie on the internet and have people believe you. If you were part of the group, you had already been vetted. So basically whatever you said had to be true, and they all trusted it, believed it, and they flocked to us like bees to honey.
Did you have anyone who suspected that you weren't who you said you were?
No, not at the beginning. They all believed because as soon as we gave them access, we kind of farmed off where the areas that they had. It was very easy to program the server so that, MythISO had this particular section, Razor had this particular section, Risk had this particular section, and they didn't cross. So they never saw the other group's stuff. They all thought they had their own individual server that we were setting up for them.
And what were you, as this server provider, what were you supposed to be getting out of it? Were they paying you to store their stuff?
No, we were part of the group. And that was just our role within the group was the storage facility, and it gave us access to the material. So if we wanted to download software, download movies, download games, we could because we had access to it, and they were fine if we downloaded that stuff. So that was our payment, was access to their material.
Okay, I know this is much more complicated, so I want to thank you for providing it at a level that even I can understand, but I'd like to learn a little bit more about who these people are. You kind of refer to them as groups, but were they groups or were they individual? And this doesn't make it insignificant. I don't want to minimize the importance of the work that you did, but are they, as you had mentioned before, college students who are, just challenging their cyber skills?
There was a little bit of that, but the majority of the people we ultimately arrested were all adults with there was one guy was the IT director at a college up in Michigan. There was another guy who was he was an IT professional in Roanoke, Virginia. They were all over the place. They all had a technical background in some respect, but none of them were younger than 21. So they were all older. They were all either towards the end of their college career or they were already in the workforce. Technical folks in the cyber world at the time, they love technology. They love to see what they can do. And a lot of them are introverted. And so this gave them a sense of camaraderie online. They were online all the time, communicating with other folks within these groups. And I think, again, part of them, they saw themselves as Robin Hoods, that, software and music and movies should all be free. We shouldn't have to pay for it. Because remember, at the time, Napster was a big thing with the illegal sharing of music through the Napster service that was ultimately shut down. But Napster is kind of like the retail part of this world, whereas the wares groups were the underground criminal enterprise that made all of this stuff available. Did
these individuals really know and realize that what they were doing was stealing?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
They absolutely knew, because there had been one or two other cases where people had been arrested and there had been reporting on it that said, hey, these guys had a search warrant served on them by the FBI or the Customs Service, and they've been arrested and they've been indicted. So they knew, they had to know at the time that what they were doing was illegal. And actually, when we ultimately did search warrants and interviewed some of them, they said, yeah, we knew what we were doing was illegal, but we didn't think anyone would ever come to us or we would never get caught.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the source, who I take it that you are not going to identify by name or...
No. I've actually interviewed him on my podcast, and I gave him a fictitious name when I interviewed him.
Okay, good. Well, then definitely anybody listening to this who wants to hear from the source should check out that episode. What I'm interested in, though, you're telling me that this operation lasted for several years, 4 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Did he work with you that entire time? And if so, what was he getting out of it? It sounds like he spent a lot of time assisting you on this operation.
Sure. Well, I think so. He joined the wares groups because he wanted to see what they were doing, because he, in his heart, thought that what they were doing was wrong. He wanted to try to figure out what it was that they were doing, and he realized what it was. He never distributed any copyrighted material. He never participated in the cracking of the encryption. He just kind of was... He had been brought in as a member because he could introduce people to other people. So he was kind of a go-between for different groups to talk to each other, introduce other folks that had talent. And so when the FBI came to him and said, hey, would you be interested in helping us? I think he saw it as, this would be an interesting opportunity, but let me see how the FBI works. So I think there was he was interested to see what we were doing. And so he had that motivation. And then ultimately, because he was spending a lot of time with me, helping to build the network, to troubleshoot issues, to make sure that it stayed online, communicating with these guys online at all hours of the night to kind of keep his bona fides going. We ultimately did give him a stipend every month for a couple of years, which made it a lot easier for him to be motivated to help us out.
Well, you just said something there that makes me curious, and that is, the 24-hour aspect of operating this.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do all of that by yourself? Did you have other people in the Charlotte office helping you out on this case? And what was your responsibility just in the hardware, the server aspect of it?
Right. So if you look at most FBI undercovers that are traditional, you have a case agent who oversees the whole thing. You have an administrative agent who does the administrative pieces. You have a finance person who handles all the money. When you get money from headquarters, you have to account for it. You might have an undercover agent who does the undercover pieces of that. You got a team. My team was me. I did all of that stuff. I was the case agent. I was the administrative agent. I dealt with all the money. I put all the computers together. I maintained the property. I dealt with the source, and I was the online undercover agent. At the time, it was a lot easier to do online undercover stuff because the FBI hadn't really figured out what are the requirements we need for that. These guys aren't touching each other face to face. They're just communicating online. So we kind of got around I never had to go to undercover school to do the undercover agent. I got an SAC approval to be the online undercover. It's different now. It's you have to go through the online undercover class. It's only a week versus 2 weeks for the regular undercover. So it's easy to get that. But because you're never face to face, there weren't that many requirements at the time, especially. And at the time when I started this, there was no cyber division. The program manager I had at FBI headquarters, I had to contact on a regular basis to get funding approval, to get other approvals to do things. It kept flopping back and forth between the criminal division in the white collar world and the terrorism division. Why it would go to the terrorism, I still don't know that to this day. But they just didn't know what to do with cyber stuff. And so I always had different program managers. So I always had to explain to them what I was doing. None of them understood it. As long as they figured they couldn't get in trouble or they weren't going to get OPR'd because of it, they kept approving everything. So anytime I ever asked for anything, I kind of always got it. And it was pretty easy at the field office level too, because the SAC who had to approve this every 6 months didn't really understand what I was doing, but he knew at the end there'd be some kind of success that would look good for the office. And so he kept approving it. There's a funny story when one of my renewals, he had seen this, he knew about this case several times. It got briefed to him periodically, but it was time for a 6-month renewal. And so I went into his office. So he had the FD 997 in front of him with, here's what we were going to do this next 6 months. Here's all the targets we were going to identify. Here's what we knew so far. Here was our plan for the next 6 months. He reads about 2 pages, takes his glasses off, puts his head in his hand, looks at me and says, explain this case to me again. Keep in mind, he had approved it 2 or 3 times beforehand, so it's not like it was a big surprise. But that was kind of what I was dealing with all over the place, was no one understood what cyber was or how to deal with cyber. This was a very unique undercover operation, which no one had seen before. The most prolific undercover up to this point was the Innocent Images undercover, which had been going on for years, but that used local law enforcement and was very well versed. This was completely different.
You shared with us your love of all things cyber. I can imagine that even though it was so much work, that going into these stores and purchasing the things that you needed, you were almost like a kid in a candy store.
That was fantastic. It was awesome. I had so much fun. I learned a lot as far as building computers and networking those computers together. I can't say I did it all by myself the whole time. There was another agent in the office who helped me out periodically. Chris Avery, he's another retired agent. He was my partner in crime, but at the end of all of this, I ended up going to headquarters as a program manager. And so he got tasked afterwards with a lot of the cleanup of these cases, but he helped me a lot. But yeah, all I did for really three or 4 years was this case, because I had to handle all the pieces of it. We started off in a little closet in the Charlotte field office, in the FBI field office in Charlotte, which was 3 floors of a bank building in downtown Charlotte at the time. They have their own office now, but at the time, that's all it was. And so I was in a closet. AT&T had to put this huge rack server in to give me 1.5 megabits worth of internet speed, which at the time was blazing. And I paid $7,600 a month for that particular service. I think that, for all I know, that particular rack is still sitting there in what's left of whatever that office space is now. And then a couple of years later, we moved into a facility that was owned by Time Warner Cable that we rented for $1,500 a month. That included the cable access, which was 10 times faster than I had initially. And that's when it really got fun, because I never had to go in the office. We called it the Bat Cave, and I would go to this offsite. I was there by myself. It had a fence around it, and I had all my server stuff in there, and I would maintain it. And it was an old Time Warner facility where people could drop off checks. And every once in a while, someone would drop off a Time Warner check in the little slot, even though there was a big sign that said, "Don't drop your payments here."
But you made sure Time Warner got their checks, right?
That I don't remember. I didn't cash them. I know I didn't do that, but I can't remember ever dropping them off and saying, "Hey, here's a payment."
I've talked about it on the podcast before in an episode that I did with a cooperating witness in one of my Group 2 undercover cases. And mine was a telemarketing fraud case. And back then, I recorded all of the interactions that I did on cassette tapes. That was my evidence. What kind of evidence? How did you record and identify who you were talking with, who you were dealing with? I'm not sure how that's done. Were you actually communicating in person, or was all of this online?
It was all online communication. So my source had a chat service set up at his house to communicate with all these guys. He had if you ever went to his house, he had a nice setup there too, with multiple monitors, multiple computers, and he had multiple windows of people he was constantly in contact with, and he would just keep those windows up all the time. So if someone wanted to find him, they knew they could go to the Myth ISO IRC channel, and you could communicate with folks there. You could keep your access on there 24 hours a day. At the undercover facility, I did the same thing. They didn't communicate with me that much because they didn't really know who I was, other than I was the brother who maintained the servers. But the IRC software records that all the time. And so every time someone would communicate, that would be stored. But that really wasn't the main part of our evidence. The main evidence we needed was to identify who was downloading the material onto the server, because they had the possession of it. And so the log files that we had, every time someone would log into our server, we would capture their username, the IP address that they came from, and what it is that they downloaded. So ultimately, I had just megabytes and megabytes worth of log files that I had to go through and parse out to figure out, okay, for this user, when did he access the server? What did he download? I actually had FBI headquarters help me out in this quite a bit, where they sent down a programmer from OTD, Operational Technology Division, who helped me program a way to parse through these log files a lot quicker. So basically it became a Google search for me. I knew who the main targets were. I'd identified leaders and what roles they ran for the different groups we were identifying. And then I would go through this. I would dump the log files into this system that OTD had created. And then I could basically Google search on their name, and it would give me all the dates and times that they logged in and uploaded or downloaded material from our server. And then I would just cross-check and do subpoenas and 2703D orders to figure out who that was assigned to at the time, because they didn't. Again, we're going back 15 years. Trying to hide your location online wasn't a big concern to these guys. They didn't have VPNs. Like now, if you're in this world now, you're using VPNs and all sorts of untraceable capabilities that they just weren't using at the time. They weren't really readily available. And they also, because they trusted us, they thought that A, we were in Canada, B, we were already vetted so we could trust them. And it was a lot quicker always to go directly from your home connection into the server. If you went through different other servers or hops or VPNs, it would slow down your capability to do what you're doing. And that's what they didn't want. They wanted as much speed as they could get. And so they would log in directly. It was great. Every person that we ended up ultimately arresting had logged in directly from home every time. And it was a lot of US folks and some folks overseas and internationally. What ultimately happened was this case became the blueprint for a bunch of other FBI cases that resulted in the first major case, Operation Fastlink in 2004, which was the coordinated takedown between the offices that were involved.
Could you explain to everyone about a coordinated takedown? I know it's more of a PR kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, so at the time, in addition to my case, initially, there were two other offices that had somewhat similar cases on smaller scales. Washington field office had one targeting a music group, and because the MPAA was located in Washington, so that was kind of their predication, was through an MPAA complaint. And there was another New Haven field office had a similar undercover where they had a source into a group. And so headquarters decided that they wanted to have one big takedown of all these guys at once, because we could do them periodically. I ultimately had 20 targets that I could focus on for this initial takedown, and 3 others in Canada, 20 in the United States, 3 in Canada. And headquarters decided, let's do a big national takedown to kind of highlight this issue, which is what they like to do with these kind of cases, is highlight this is a problem and here's what it is and here's why we did what we did. So they coordinated and developed what was called Operation Fastlink, which was designated as a major case because it included Operation Sudden Urge and the New Haven and the Washington field office case. So they brought everybody together to FBI headquarters, and the 3 case agents stood up, explained what their case was, explained how it was predicated, what we did, what evidence we had, who we were targeting, all that kind of stuff. And then I know that for myself, I had target packages that I had created that had all the evidence that the agents in these other field offices needed to get a search warrant, perform the search warrant, seize the data, and then how to send it back to us.
Now, I would imagine that the software manufacturers, those companies, would have been pleased that the FBI had taken on this case. Did you have any interaction with those companies?
Yeah, so I had a lot of Xbox games on my server, in addition to a lot of software and other stuff. And so it was hard for me. Software is very easy to confirm that it is what it is. So we would download it, and then I would burn it onto a CD and see if I could run it. And that would confirm that that software is legitimate. And then I would contact the manufacturer just for them to get confirmation that, yes, that is our software. It is exactly what it says it is. It has been cracked, and we have a problem with that. So it's harder to do with Xbox games. I didn't have an Xbox. So I say this just as an anecdote because it was interesting when you talked earlier about having fun with this, is I contacted Microsoft, said, look, I'm doing this case. I got these groups that have they're compromising your games, but I can't run them. They sent me a where's ready Xbox that I could run these compromised games on. It was fantastic. As far as evidence collection, I could download an Xbox game, put it on a DVD, stick it in this Xbox that Microsoft had specifically modified for me, and verify that these games were what they were. So that was kind of the interaction with them, was they knew we had cases going on, but they didn't know the extent to what it was when the takedowns ultimately happened. I think they got a little heads up from DOJ this was happening. And then I know that at least during the first takedown, there was a lot of press from the Business Software Alliance and MPAA and RIAA, the recording industry, that were very favorable to all the actions we were taking.
Are you a gamer?
Oh, yes. Sadly, I am.
So, yeah, I could see you just having a wonderful time. I mean, a legitimate...
Trust me. People in the office loved it as well. Because every once in a while, if there was something else going on and people were in the office for a while, I'd bring the Xbox into the office and we would evaluate the evidence.
Yes, yeah. That's very important to do, to authenticate the evidence that you have. Yeah, they loved you.
Yes, people were fans of my case, that's for sure.
So what was the results of, I want to hear, you were talking about how you sent out leads to other offices where your subjects were located and had those lead agents do the searches and I take it arrest of the individuals.
Actually, I didn't arrest anybody, just did search warrants. There were no arrests so the takedown was in April of 2004. Operation Fastlink went live in April of 2004. And there were search warrants executed all over the country. Now, ironically for me, none were in Charlotte, which was probably good because I had a command post set up with my DOJ attorneys. So there was, at the time, the prosecutor in Charlotte there was one prosecutor in Charlotte, but he got assistance from the DOJ CSIPs, the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section in DOJ. And so there were two DOJ lawyers that came down for the takedown. And we basically sat there in a conference room all day and waited for field offices to call us and say, yes, we just executed your search warrant. We got this much material. We got, 3 computers and a bunch of CDs. And we interviewed the person, and most of them confessed. As soon as the FBI knocked in the door, most of them just confessed. There was one odd one in Boston where a friend of mine, Chris Geary, was the case agent, and I believe that particular subject had some form of autism or something along those lines. That the house was weird. He knew that he was being raided, and he was apparently sitting on his bed, shaking back and forth, saying no, 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 holding like some kind of machete or something. They had to kind of tackle him to the ground. His parents were very upset. And that particular subject, ultimately, this is kind of a sad story to the whole thing. He ended up jumping in front of a train ultimately, during this whole process. Yeah.
And I know this is a stereotype, but I mean, some of these individuals, as you said, are very introverted. And so their computers and the things that they're doing online, that's their whole life. And so here are FBI agents coming in and taking their computer and their servers. And I can imagine how devastating that was. I mean, wow.
Oh, and you know how we do search warrants. It's brute force. And by brute force, I mean a lot of people at 6 o'clock in the morning. So these were all done at 6 o'clock in the morning. So you've got probably 8 FBI agents surrounding your house, knocking on the door saying, FBI search warrant, let us in. These people were not, they weren't drug dealers. They weren't, violent offenders, but they were still they were actually doing more damage financially to legitimate business than your drug dealer or your violent offender. So that's very important for us to stress. Mm-hmm. Right. So sure, it was in that, and that made it, I think, easy to get confessions because they didn't know what to do. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah, I guess it's better if I just say, yes, this is what we did. And so I know that in one field office, Chicago field office, the target we had identified. I went out to interview them, and they ended up taking that particular person, using them as a source and starting their own undercover.
And that's how it works. and
Yep.
and all of our violations. Yeah, so that's good. That's a good thing.
And it's funny because obviously in this world, once these takedowns start happening, it gets around the world pretty quickly. So the source was also monitoring the IRC chat when these takedowns started going on. And so he called me and said, yeah, it's blowing up. Everybody's shutting everything down. I got calls from all the groups saying, hey, turn down they wanted us to shut down the server, which we did not do, obviously. And so they were all trying to figure out who dimed them out, how did people find them, all this kind of stuff. So it became huge in the wares community that this was happening, because this was at the time the largest international takedown of the wares community ever. We seized more evidence than any case had ever seized before. There was like hundreds of computers, terabytes worth of material seized, and only a couple people thought my source was the result of it. And because he was able to talk his way out of it, most times when undercovers go to that point where they do the takedown and they arrest, or they do search warrants and possible arrests, the undercover closes. I was able to convince headquarters to let my undercover continue, because not only did my source not get released as the person who was in charge of this, nor was there really a press conference to say that Charlotte field office was doing this, and not that they knew we were in Charlotte anyway, but I was able to keep the undercover going for another year. There was another takedown a year later called Operation Sightdown, which did the same thing, which in that case, I went from only doing U.S. subjects in Canada to I did U.S. subjects, Canada, Israel, Belgium, England, Portugal, I believe. I think I said Germany. And so ended up being like 7 countries that I ended up sending. I coordinated with international folks to go arrest those people as well.
Well, that's very impressive. So what were your results? Because, as FBI agents,
sure, yes,
we know about the FD 515, which is where you record your statistical results. Right. And at the end, unfortunately, no matter how much hard work you've done, sometimes that's the bottom line.
Right. So we had 19 indictments, 19 convictions. None of them went to trial. They all pled guilty. Most of them got a year and a day was the standard sentence that most of them got. Again, because at the time, the law just hadn't caught up to an impact what they were doing. So most of them got away with a year and a day. So it was 19 convictions over those 2 major case takedowns. I had 5 international convictions. I think we ultimately said we dismantled 6 wares organizations, seized tons of, we never got any restitution. Yeah, no restitution other than whatever they were charged at trial, which was usually court fee and $1,000 or something. So there was no seizure of anything because all they had was computer stuff. So I guess I take that back. We did seize they never got their computers back. So we had a lot of hardware that we had at the end. And like I said, my friend Chris Avery had to do with all the distribution of all my hardware afterwards because I had left to go to headquarters. So I left him with the mess afterwards.
Oh, what a good friend you are.
Yes. That's my biggest regret is having done that. But, it is what it is.
Well, you mentioned at the very beginning that just because of manpower issues and different priorities that no one is really doing these type of cases. But I can only imagine that the crime, online piracy and theft of intellectual property is still going on.
Oh, and it's not only from a criminal perspective, from a nation state perspective, it's a huge problem. If you look at intellectual property of our nation state secrets and our national defense information, the criminals started it, obviously. The wares groups, these were all individuals involved in a criminal enterprise. They didn't realize, they wouldn't classify it as a criminal enterprise. They would classify it as just, normal people trying to help out the little guy. But China, Russia, Iran, North Korea has now looked at what these guys did and figured out, hey, we can steal all this stuff too. We can reverse engineer and create it ourselves. There's a lot, it's a lot larger problem. And you do see the occasional convictions of intellectual property theft at a nation state level. But as far as the wares community, it still exists. It's still huge. It's just better hidden, harder to identify, and harder to prosecute because everybody uses VPNs. So you can make it appear like you're coming from Kazakhstan. Needless to say, you're not arresting anybody in Kazakhstan for making available some piece of software, movie, music, or game. It's kind of like the drug war. We haven't solved that either. And with cyber stuff, you're never going to, technology advances very quickly. The bad guys figure out how to exploit that technology a lot quicker than anybody else. Law enforcement's a little bit, actually quite a bit behind trying to figure out how the bad guys have created this capability and used it to commit crimes. And then, our politicians are way behind worrying about cow flatulence or whatever, not really concerned about this issue. So that is why it's always the bad guys are always going to be ahead of this and able to expand on what they're doing.
Well, I have to tell you a quick little story about my involvement in theft of intellectual property. It doesn't compare to what you were talking about, but my podcast, I had an episode that I did with a retired agent, Dan Riley, and he was talking about a hitman in Washington, D.C. He worked out at WFO, the Washington Field Office. And the guy's name was Wayne Perry. I had no idea at the time that this Wayne Perry, this murderer, was a cult figure. And so we did the episode. And then a few weeks later, I kept getting emails from people saying that somebody, stole your episode. And I went on YouTube and somebody had downloaded the episode that I had done, put it on YouTube. And to date, they have 861,000 views of my episode, which if you look at my YouTube channel, I have 13,000 downloads of that episode. So, I contacted the guy. Not only did he steal the episode, but he cut off the introduction so you couldn't figure out where the episode had come from. You couldn't tell. And so he at least agreed to put into the comment section the information about, my podcast and my website and things like that. But I've gotten a good number of listeners from his pirated episode. So, there's some advantages out of it. But yeah, it is disturbing to see where people can just take your stuff and use it for their own benefit. It's irritating.
Oh, sure. So you figure, he's 800,000 views and you may have gotten, let's say you've got 2,000 new listeners out of it. That's great. It's kind of like if I have a $700 piece of software and 1 million people download it illegally, 2,000 buy it from me after they've illegally evaluated it. I'm still not making that money back. So it's still a huge loss there. Can I tell you one funny story about the site down piece that it still makes me laugh to this day? I told you about how I came up with sudden urge and how I didn't know what I was doing. Well, the New Haven agent who was in Fastlink was now my program manager at FBI headquarters, and him and I had kind of come up with how to do site down and how we were going to do another coordinated takedown with our case, the Chicago case, and a San Jose case, because San Jose had started a similar undercover to mine, because they'd actually called me and said, "Hey, how do you do what you're doing?" And I kind of explained it, and they did a similar thing for a group that was dealing in movie distribution. And so we were going to do a takedown of their case and whatever. So we're trying to come up with what are we going to call this new major case. So Fastlink was the first one. We wanted to have a name for this one. So I came up with Operation Dev Null, which again, as I always laughed at a lot of people at headquarters didn't understand the cyber piece. That is a cyber term, which basically means if you create a piece of code in programming that says something equals dev null, means it goes nowhere. And so that's why I wanted to call the second major case Operation Dev Null. So he brought that up to the managers above him to get approval. They didn't know what it meant, so they wouldn't approve it. So we ended up going with site down because they at least understood what that meant.
That would have been really funny when the case came down, because all of the people that were subjects, they would know what it meant.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, but Robert Mueller would have said, "What the hell is this?"
Yeah, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the point of the interview where I'd like to get to know more about you, when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
All right. So I tell this story when I did a lot of outreach presentations with the FBI, and I would usually have to tell the story because people would always say, "How does this happen?" So I was a high school science teacher in Orlando, Florida from 1993 to 1999. In 1998, I was doing summer school with another teacher, and I was kind of looking forward. I had a newborn daughter and my wife was pregnant. And so I'm starting to think, okay, in 30 years, what can I do when I get to the end of my teaching career? Well, my one option is I could substitute teach. That didn't sound very appealing to me. So I was teaching summer school biology with another teacher. He was doing the lecture piece and I would do the administrative piece. It was a pretty big class, so they needed 2 people. And in 1998, the internet existed such that it was, and I was on a Mac computer, and we had an internet connection. I somehow, and I'll give this as God's intervention, but I ended up on the FBI webpage, and at the front of the webpage said, "Now accepting applicants for special agent." And I thought, well, I'd always thought about doing law enforcement, but I didn't want to be a state trooper or a local police officer. I'm like, well, that would be interesting. Let me try that. Can't remember I don't think it was online. I had to download something and send it in, but I sent that in, and then I got the letter to go to phase 1 testing, passed that, did my application, got to phase 2 testing. And I remember that there was a math teacher at the school who looked at me and said, and because some people knew I had applied to be in the FBI. And so he looked at me and said, "Yeah, you're a 30-year-old white guy. Good luck with that." But it went through. I got through phase 2 testing, passed my background check, and 13 months after I applied, I was walking through the doors at Quantico, Virginia for new agent class 9919.
Yeah, I do think that is a misconception that people have because, even today, it's still 70% of FBI agents are white males. Black females make up 1%.
Funny thing was, I talked to a lot of people who want to get in the FBI, and they're like, "Well, I'm a criminal justice major." And I'm like, "That's not going to help you." Yeah. I go, "You need to get like a foreign language or, do something more. Go on the FBI webpage and see what they're hiring for and get that degree." Like right. Technology obviously is a big thing. And so, you don't have to have a law enforcement background. You don't have to have a military background. It certainly helps. Don't get me wrong, but it's not, lawyers and accountants aren't getting in immediately like they used to.
Well, if there are science high school teachers listening to this, I hope that as soon as they finish the episode, they go to the FBI website Absolutely. And download the application because
there were 2 other teachers in my new agent class in addition to myself.
Yeah, that's just something people don't think about. Mm-hmm. That the FBI is looking for just about everyone who can come and do the job.
Absolutely. If you can think for yourself and work independently, you'll do great.
All right. So you had a wonderful career in the FBI, did a lot of things, and then you retired. When did you retire and what are you doing now?
The last 9 years of my career, I worked counterintelligence and cyber kind of at the same time because of the blending of those two things. And so I was eligible for retirement on September 25th, 2019. So that February 25th, 2019 was a Wednesday. I had put in my papers earlier. I had my going away party on Friday, September 27th, 2019, and my last day in the FBI pay period was Saturday, September 28th, 2019. So I retired after that, got hired by a cleared defense contractor here, and I'm deputy director and in charge of outreach for the National Cybersecurity Operations Center in Huntsville, Alabama, which is designed to provide cybersecurity defensive services to the defense industrial base. We are under a contract from the U.S. government, so the services that we provide to small and medium-sized customers is at no charge to them. So they get cybersecurity for free.
Let's use this opportunity as a recruitment message for people listening. Tell us more about how you ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, and what's going on there as far as the Bureau is concerned.
That's a good point. So I was a team leader in Inspection Division in 2013, and unlike most of the other team leaders who became ASAC's Assistant Special Agent in Charge, I decided that really wasn't what I wanted to do. I loved being a field supervisor, and I still had 5 years I could do that because I'd been a field supervisor in Cleveland before. So the Birmingham Division counterintelligence program came open. One of my best friends in the FBI was the cyber supervisor, so I knew that we could work together quite well, blending both of our programs together. And so I put in for the job here, got it, and moved here in 2014 until I retired in 2019. And in Huntsville, obviously, they are moving a lot of the non-operational divisions to Huntsville on this huge facility on the Redstone Arsenal, a several billion-dollar facility that's currently being built because they realize that things like HRD, certain training aspects, don't necessarily have to be done in Washington, D.C. It's a lot cheaper to live here. And so there are currently 1,800 jobs that are moving to the Huntsville area. The number I've heard is fluctuated between 4,000 and 5,000 ultimately. The funny thing that we're noticing is that of the jobs that are moving here, so 1,800 funded positions are moving from the Washington National Capital Region to Huntsville, Alabama, but only 30% of the people currently in those jobs are moving with it because they just don't want to move to Alabama. And so Huntsville, Alabama really is Northern Virginia. It's just placed in Alabama. The only difference is instead of having 7 targets, we have 2. So, but everything that you would want in Northern Virginia is here, other than mass transit is not really that great, but you can get anywhere in 15 minutes. So if you're looking to join the FBI and you want to move to a great city, there'll be a lot of jobs in Huntsville.
Excellent. And I will put a link to the FBIjobs.gov website and the section that they have there about positions in Huntsville, Alabama.
And there's more coming.
All right. So I like to end the episode by giving my guests the last word. So what would you like to say?
In the world of cyber, no one expects to be a victim. Never in my career did I go to someone who had had a compromise and the first thing they said was, well, we knew it was going to happen. It was our turn. No one thinks they're going to be a victim. Yet everyone is subject to becoming a victim of some kind of cybercrime down the line, be it a ransomware of your business, someone steals your information online, your, adult widowed parent finds love online and ends up sending thousands of dollars to somebody in Nigeria. It's very easy for you to learn about ways to not be a victim. Education is the key thing for all of us to prevent ourselves from becoming cyber victims. So I don't have a book on this, but I have a friend of mine, Scott Augenbaum, has a book called The Secrets of Cybersecurity. I would look to that if you could, but train yourself on how to be educated as far as what the threats are. Cyber risk is going to be with us forever, and risk is threats times vulnerabilities. So there's always going to be threats that are targeting us, be it criminal, nation state, terrorism, whatever. And there's going to be vulnerabilities we have that allow those threats to access our personal information. Those vulnerabilities are your phone, your Internet of Things device at your house, your Alexa, your smart TV, all have vulnerabilities that could make you victim. So educate yourself on how not to be a victim, how to reduce those vulnerabilities, and look for places where you can find that education. There's a lot of it that's free online. And just train yourself as to what the cyber threats are, and you can protect yourself, your family, and your business from becoming the next cyber victim.
And that's the end of the episode. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Darren Mott, articles about online takedowns and intellectual property theft cases. There is, of course, a link to Darren's podcast, The CyBUr Guy, and a link to the FBIjobs.gov page about jobs at the FBI's new facilities at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.